Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your host today, and I'm here with a really interesting writer and journalist and person in film who has done a whole bunch of really interesting things and written a whole bunch of really interesting books. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your work, please?
Hi, Jen. Yes, my name is Jonathan Melville. And I'm, well, as you say, I write the occasional book and do a bit of film journalism based here in Scotland. I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland. And yeah, the books I've written are Seeking Perfection. I'm trying to remember all the names now. Seeking Perfection, the unofficial guide to Tremors, and Highlander, the making the original classic. And most recently, Local Hero, making a Scottish classic. I think I might have got the title slightly wrong with the second one, but basically a book about Highlander and a book about Local Hero and a book about Tremors. And yeah, and that's kept me busy for the last, 13 years or so, I think.
Yeah, I was really happy that if I remember correctly, I think we sort of met through the comment section on a mutual friend's Twitter, Austin Trunick, who has also been on this show. And yes. I was really excited about that because when I looked at your work, you had worked on, you had written about so many movies that I loved. And you were working on things going forward about other things that I love. And so, yeah, thank you for coming to the show. I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about, what got you interested in film? Like, how did you become a film person? Because I'm always interested in, people's journeys toward that. And what made you decide to start writing about film and researching, the histories of particular films?
Yeah, well, I suppose what got me into film was originally just seeing films. So I suppose going to the cinema. And I can remember I was born here in Edinburgh and in the 1976. So, in the sort of early 80s, that was for me just a brilliant time for going to the cinema. So, getting to see things like E.T., Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones, these sort of things when they were brand new, and being just, I think, just at the right age to really appreciate them for being just these sort of nonsense. Well, obviously very well made nonsense, but just fun, entertaining films, I should say. That's a better way of putting it. So I kind of fell in love with films then. But when I was 10, I moved from Edinburgh, which is, for people who don't know, it's the capital capital city of Scotland, moved up to the Highlands of Scotland, up to a little village called Golspie, which is in the middle of nowhere. And I kind of mention that in the books. In the introductions, it sort of comes up a little bit, I suppose, my kind of cinematic or my history with film. And when I moved up there, we didn't have a cinema, and the closest cinema was in Inverness, which was about 50 miles away, and we didn't have a car. So I kind of went from being able to see lots of films at the cinema to being able to see maybe one or two a year at the cinema, and maybe having and not having a video recorder for a long time. So it feels a bit of a sounds like a bit of a sad story for a film fan. But at the same time, I got more into TV. So although I'd always been I enjoyed television and used to love Saturday. We used to get all the American shows usually on a Saturday, things like the A-Team and the Dukes of Hazzard and Airwolf and all those sorts of things. But I really got into Doctor Who, which I'd always known about, but I'd always been watching ITV, which is the channel that a lot of these things were on. And Doctor Who was on BBC. And so I didn't really watch them that much. So anyway, basically this, I suppose what happened is I got into Doctor Who and discovered that when I got into it in sort of 1987-ish, it had been going for 25 years. And so there was all this history, and it got cancelled actually just soon after I got interested in it. So in 1989, it got cancelled. So suddenly I was a brand new fan of this TV show that had just been cancelled. But there was 25 years of history. So I started reading books about it, about Doctor Who. and there were so many books and so many, you could just read the whole history of this series. It was quite easy to find and, well, to read about. And I suppose that's what really got me interested in the history of film and TV, because I think I just really appreciated the fact that people were writing these books, and I was buying fanzines, and then of course you read about an actor that's in your favorite series and you find out they were in other films and other TV shows, so then you become a fan of those and you start reading about those. So that's really where my interest, I suppose, in the history side of things, and the just sort of the backstory of a film and TV show. And then fast forward, I suppose, I won't go through all my history, but I did publishing at university, so came back down to Edinburgh, and then in the mid-90s got back into going to the cinema again. And that's at a time when I think I was thinking about this recently, and I think the first Empire magazine that I bought, the British magazine, was either Speed or True Lies on the front cover. One of those sort of films. And so I just loved all those those crazy those action films and things that came out around that time, and The Rock and Con Air and things like that.
Yes.
and so anyway, I started getting into film journalism a few years later, which wasn't my career. I didn't go to university to train to be a journalist or anything, but I just, as a fan, I decided I wanted to write reviews. And actually, one of the things was I wanted to get Blu-rays. I got a Blu-ray player, and I can remember thinking, if I write off to the PR companies, they'll maybe send me Blu-rays, because Blu-rays are quite new, and I'll maybe get free ones and I can build up my collection. And actually, so it was that sort of thing that started me then writing reviews, and then doing things for the radio and starting my own website. And then at one point I thought I'd like to write a book. And this is quite a long answer, I appreciate it, but I'm trying to squeeze everything in here. I thought, I have all these books about films and TV shows on my shelf. I would love to write one. And a lot of people that I know, or that I followed on maybe on Twitter, or that I would meet at events or conventions or whatever, had written things. And I was thinking, I'd love to do that. I'd love to have something. But what do you write about? Because everything seems to be written about. And I love the Tremors movies. And I remember watching Tremors on TV in 1991 or 2 or 3. I can't quite remember now. But I loved it. And I just, there were all these sequels, and it was such a fascinating franchise. I wrote an article for a magazine, SFX magazine, about Tremors, interviewed some people involved, and then thought, why don't I use these interviews for a book? And then did another 50 or so interviews. So that's kind of the long but also shortish version of how I got to write. I was a fan and thought I would try it myself. Does that answer the original question, which you asked me about 20 minutes ago?
It was a great answer, and it provoked so many more questions.
Oh, good. Okay.
So just, for the listeners, my cat is completely disrupting the show. So apologies if you hear like a cat complaining. But the first thing that really spoke to me that you said was encountering film through books, because it really spoke to my experience as a teen when I was like graduating high school and heading into college. There were a whole bunch of British TV shows that I had really desperately wanted to see for a long time, because I became a fan of Monty Python through our public TV over here. Okay. And there was no way to really view any of that stuff at the time over here. Now you can kind of see whatever you want, whenever you want. Yes. So one of the things that I did was I would buy books of the scripts of a lot of TV shows that I couldn't watch, like Fry and Laurie, and a lot of like the comedic shows. And so I really like that idea of like encountering movies through books when you can't really quite access them directly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with Doctor Who, as you may know, or a lot of listeners I'm sure will know, so much of the early Doctor Who is gone because it was wiped. It was the BBC didn't have space on their tapes, so they got rid of them. So that's another interesting thing to try and read about, the history of something that doesn't completely exist, I suppose. And okay, the audio still exists of these stories, but but just, yeah, I found that fascinating, and I think most fans do. And also sometimes they would reappear. Sometimes they would find episodes in strange parts of the world. And so no, it was brilliant just reading about these things and finding out what had gone before, and discovering this whole past and this whole history. It was great fun.
Yeah.
And that's something I just try to do, I suppose, with my things, is just try and delve a bit deeper and find out the stuff. And just to say as well, the reason I write these books is because I love the subject matter, and I want to know, because somebody else hasn't written the book, I think, right, well, I better write it then, so that I can find out how it happens, and then hopefully other people find it interesting.
It's such a good way to approach finding a subject, I think, too, because, if you have thought about, wanting to read a book about a particular subject, chances are somebody else has also had that thought, and like there's already always an audience for something, and so
Totally.
I love that you chose Tremors in particular. Like, I just love that era of filmmaking. It's, also when I kind of like started seeing movies was in like the 80s. The first film I ever saw in theaters was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is like such a good
Brilliant.
movie.
Yeah.
Really spoiled me for the
Uh-huh.
but and one of the things that I was curious about as I was looking into your books was that you have interviewed so many cool people for these books. And as somebody who interviews, folks myself, I would love to know about how you approach them. Like, how do you approach contacting people? How do you approach framing questions? And then how do you incorporate them into a larger history?
Whoa, that's another very long answer, I think. But
I'm
I
really bad
think,
about that. I do that a lot.
no, it's good though. I think so approaching people, I mean, it starts in different ways. So I think going right back to the beginning with Tremors, the first interview I did was with one of the creators of Tremors, Steve Wilson. And there was a website, and maybe I think there still is actually, for his production company, Stampede Entertainment. So I just emailed the website and said, would you be interested in doing an interview for a magazine about Tremors? And I think it was the 21st anniversary at that point. And he said yes. And then I can't quite remember how I got Michael Gross, who is Burt Gummer. But I discovered quite early on this thing called IMDb Pro. So we all know about IMDb, but there's a secret version of IMDb Pro that the industry uses, the film industry and TV industry. And that's, you pay to use that one. And you can find out the details of people's agents or actors' agents. And sometimes most people really involved in films are on there. And a lot of them have contact details. It might be their own email address. It might be their own phone number. So some of the people that I spoke to for Tremors just had their own phone number on there. So the chap that played Miguel in Tremors, he, I think, just had his phone number. So sometimes you just phone them up. So that's how that started. And I would just email and say, I've spoken to Steve Wilson. Would you be interested? And I don't know for certain, but I think sometimes there's maybe a bit of a, I think some of these people maybe email their friends. So if I say I've spoken to one person, then someone else might email them and say, how was it? Was he okay in the interview? Did he ask you stupid questions, or, was he late for the interview? All these sorts of things. So I think it's almost like a domino effect. I think if you can say you've got one person, then the next person says, oh, well, if they've done it. So that's really how it works, I feel, for me anyway. And when it comes to questions, that's a tricky one, I suppose. I mean, I guess it depends on, of course, what the person's involvement was in the film, or mainly films that I've been writing about. But if it's the creator, like Steve Wilson was, then of course there's so many questions because he was involved at so many stages. The entire stage, he had the original idea for Tremors when he was out in the desert, and he sat on a rock and thought, what would happen if a giant worm came up through the ground? So he was there from the very beginning. So there's so many questions. And then I think with Steve, there were actually a couple of interviews, because I probably asked as many questions as I could at the time. And then when it developed into a book, I think I went back to him with more questions, because the more people I spoke to, the more questions that came up. And I suppose that's the other thing. The more people you speak to, as I just said, the more questions come up, and the more things you learn, the more things you discover. You find out that actually there was someone else involved who we've never heard of, or who's not credited, or and what did they do? So the questions just evolve, I think, and develop from that. And was there a third part to that question that?
Oh, yes, but before I'll get to that, but also I have more questions now. I wonder, I love the point about how, it does get easier as you go on, because you do also, you develop a track record and people come to trust you. And I think that, this leads to the third part, which is that I imagine that when people who have, high profiles or have done these creative things, speak to people, they are concerned about how you're going to use their words and whether you're going to use them respectfully or take them out of context and stuff like that. And so, that leads us to what the third part was, which was, how do you synthesize multiple interviews into a single narrative?
Well, the way I did it, I think every book is slightly different, but with the Tremors one, then, just as an example, I mean, the other thing I'll just say before I answer that is I kept putting off. So if anyone's listening to this who's thinking of writing a book, just to say, try and start it, because I kept putting it off. I find notepads still, because I've just got lots of little notepads lying around. I find the odd notepad and it'll have a little contents page of a potential Tremors book. So something I wrote years ago, and I said, I could do this, that, and the other. And I just kept putting it off. And I said, I've never written a book before. I don't know how to write a book. I'm not going to write a book. And that happened for so many years. And I now kick myself for doing that. But it's a scary prospect, starting in anything creative. Of course it is, whether that's, I'm sure it must be the same for musicians or, anything, putting yourself out there and just start, because it's easy just to watch the telly and put your feet up, or go to bed, or have a long lie in the morning, or whatever. And actually putting the effort into emailing people and asking for an interview, and then arranging the interview and all that sort of stuff takes a lot of work. So it's a side note, really, just to say, if you were like me, please just put the effort in, because one day it's worth it. I think it might not work. Usually things do, but even if it doesn't, at least you know that you tried. So anyway, that's a side note. But just to say about the synthesizing with Tremors, it was a case really of doing all these interviews, working out a rough structure of the book, and then really just copying and pasting the interviews into a Googled, I think it was maybe a Word doc back, it was about 2012-ish, I think I started writing it properly, and it came out in 2015. So it was just copying and pasting and saying, okay, I know that for the first film, which is the majority of the book, it's going to be split into maybe 10 or 11 chapters. This book will be about before Tremors. This is about having the idea. This chapter is about being in Lone Pine. So it was just, again, this rough idea of how I thought it would be, put the interviews in the positions that I thought they should be in, and then starting to join the dots. And I think at the start, I probably, it really helped having people to read what I was doing, different drafts of it, having friends read it and say, okay, you've not said enough there, or it doesn't make sense, or you've glossed over things too much. Because I wanted the people, and it's the same with all of these things, I don't write them to put across all my own theories on a film. I don't think I'm very good at that. I think I can write a review that's maybe 100, a couple hundred words, or I could talk about a film on a podcast. But when it comes to writing a full-length book, I don't really want to just say, and I think this means this, and I really like this bit, and this is what happened, and why did they not do this? It's more about the people that were involved in the films. I want them to be able to tell their story in their own words. So I just feel that my job is to sort of facilitate that, really. And as I say, fill in the blanks a little bit when you're trying to connect one story to another. And also because a lot of these films were made maybe 30 or 40 years ago, memories change, and people forget things, or, one story that they've maybe told 100 times to their friends becomes fact, when actually you speak to someone else and that was not quite the story. So it's interesting that way to try and then work out what is the real story. And then you can find facts in documents, sometimes in call sheets, which films and TV shows have, where I'm sure a lot of people listening to this know this. I don't want to make it sound like they don't, but if you don't, basically a call sheet is kind of as it sounds. It's the document that people get on the day of a shoot or the night before. Sometimes it says, this is on this day, this is what we'll be filming. Mm-hmm. And they also do little reports as well at the end of them. So for Highlander, for example, there's a scene in Highlander at the end of the film when they're having the big fight scene on Silver Cup. And in reality, and when they were making the film, Christopher Lambert jumped off. There was a safety mat, and he jumped onto it, and it ripped. And one of the people I spoke to said that he had his sword. I can't remember if it was in his mouth or if he was just holding it, but he fell onto it and it ripped it. And a couple of people told that story. And when I spoke to Christopher Lambert, he denied that. And he said, no, that didn't happen at all. But when you actually get the document that was written up afterwards to say what actually happened on the day, you see that, yes, he kind of did do what people say he did. Or at least that's what they said on the day. So anyway, it's just kind of corroborating evidence, I suppose. It's a bit like a detective, I think. It's or I suppose this is what historians do. And I've actually been saying the last few years, I'm never quite sure if I can call myself a film historian. I like the term. I don't know if I am one. I think I might be, but it's not the sort of thing you apply to be, a film historian. It just happens because you're writing about a film history, I suppose.
Yeah, I would say you are. At very least, you're
I think so, a little bit.
Yeah. That's really cool. And, I do think, while you were talking, I was thinking about how you are doing what any historian does, which is working with primary sources, but then also interrogating them a little bit and comparing them in order to get a sense of what really happened. Because no source is going to be 100% accurate besides the ones that are the most reliable, like the call sheets and things.
Yes.
One of the things that I really appreciated about looking into your career and looking at some of your books was that, you wrote about movies that I love, like Highlander and Tremors. But I also, I hadn't heard of Local Hero before this, and I watched it and I loved it. It's so, so good. And I was really struck by how, I was trying to find a sort of connecting thread between the films you choose to write about besides the time period. And, a couple of them are sort of about this encounter between America and Scotland, in some interesting ways. And is that something that you think about a lot, or?
I don't know. I mean, I have wondered a little bit, is there something about the films that, I've sort of wondered myself, is there a connection there? I mean, partly, as I say, it's just films that I really enjoy, but I think with Local Hero and Tremors, there's a small community. And I think, and there's a TV show that I love, which I'm actually writing a book about as well, which I've been working on for maybe 12 or 13 years on and off, called Hamish Macbeth, which was made in Scotland by the BBC in 1995, 4 or 5. Anyway, that's a small community set in the west coast of Scotland. And I used to live in a village in the north of Scotland. And so I think there's something possibly in that, which is I suppose it is subconscious, although as I say it, I suppose I must be aware of it. But just that community sort of facing up to things and interesting characters. And I think the interesting thing about Local Hero and Tremors again is the sort of way that the supporting characters are almost more important than the lead character, or equal, I suppose. Whereas in a lot of films and TV, there's obviously the hero or heroine, and there are these other characters that pop up and then disappear again. Whereas in these ones, if you didn't have the supporting characters, you wouldn't have a story. So there's something in that, I think it's just something about. I think there must be a connection back to living in a village and I don't know, I suppose feeling maybe slightly trapped actually, because in Golspie, where I was from the age of 10 till maybe 18, it was difficult to get out if you didn't have a car. There was a train station, but at a certain age, your parents don't really want you going on the train, off on your own. So there's maybe something in that. I think if you looked into the psychology of it, I'm sure we could be here for another few hours. But luckily there were no giant worms or anything like that in Golspie. But and I look back now, I was very lucky to live there, because it was a beautiful little place, and but only a few thousand people. But so no, I think there's something about that, really, just that connection. Highlander doesn't quite fit that, but I suppose, I don't know. I mean, yeah, you're right. There's that that American Scottish connection, and I suppose there's just maybe something. I don't know. We don't have, not that many films really have been made in Scotland. I'm sure a lot of people would think I'm talking nonsense, but really we're not a huge production. There's a lot more happening today, right this minute. Actually, there's more coming to Scotland, but over the last 40 years, we've had there's only a sort of a handful of films, I think, that have gone global then, let's say, or that are maybe you could almost call iconic. Maybe that's not the right word, but something like Highlander, of course, people love it from all parts of the world, and it's a recognizably Scottish film, I suppose, even though it's not, because it was made by an English production a company based in England by some American producers. And then Local Hero, which was, the idea came from an English producer, David Putnam. Okay, it was written and directed by Bill Forsyth, but it was sort of some American money and a bit of British money. But these films are sort of few and far between. If you were really to think about really iconic Scottish films, there are, of course, maybe 10, 20 or so. But if I was to ask you, I'm not going to, but if I was to ask you to list all the Scottish films, I don't know how many you would know. I think the average American, let's say, might, and I say that just because they're not in Scotland. It could be the average Norwegian or the average, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know how many films are just. So I suppose writing about those is actually kind of interesting for me, because maybe more people have heard of them. And they might buy the book, although it's not me trying to be cynical, because Highlander is still quite a niche audience. It's not Star Wars, and it's not Star Trek, but it has a devoted fan base. And Local Hero is a little bit more mainstream, but even then it's 40 years old, so a lot of people have not heard of it.
Yeah.
I speak to younger people and they're like, "Oh no, I don't know that one." And I thought, "Oh, how can you not know Local Hero?" But so yeah, I don't know if that answers that question, but there's a few different reasons why I write about these ones, but it's mainly because I love them. It all goes back to that still.
I do like the point about them being about small communities, and something that I think Local Hero and Tremors did share too is that it has this very, like, there are some quirky portrayals of, like local eccentrics, but it's loving, like it's not contemptuous and it's not derisive, or like it's like, yeah, it's very loving in its portrayal of like a community.
I think so, and I think the great thing about Local Hero is that the locals are smarter. That I think it would be so easy to make them, the daft. Yes. The daft locals that don't really know what's happening, but of course they're very aware, and there's just that brilliant scene in the film where they're in the church, where you think that they're being taken advantage of by the American, by Peter Rieger and Peter Capaldi, and then suddenly you see them all in the church talking about it, saying how much money we're going to get. It's a real twist, and it's really clever, and the whole film is just like that. It's not what you think it's going to be.
So looking ahead to stuff that you're working on right now, I know that you're working on a book about Jim Henson and his various productions, which is extremely exciting to me. It's part of like that same, well, he spans decades, but like, he is part of that same decade, the 80s, especially Fraggle Rock, which I am a particular fan of. I love all of his works, but in particular, I really love Fraggle Rock. And I saw an interview that you had done with one of the writers for Fraggle Rock, Victor. Oh my
Victor
God.
Pemberton.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it kind of like just blew my mind in a way that I probably, it should have happened years ago. But that, I thought I knew Fraggle Rock so well, but then reading that, I'm like, oh yeah, like this, there's like whole portions of Fraggle Rock that I haven't seen that were the interstitial locally filmed scenes, and to get some insight into what that looked like was super interesting. And so what drew you to Henson, and like what are, I know it's hard for authors to talk about things that are still upcoming, but like, can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, the Muppet Show is one of the earliest things I remember in my life. I mean, it started, I was born in July 76, and the Muppet Show started in October 1976, and all filmed in the UK. So I kind of, I suppose, grew up with it for the first few years. And I can remember it being on TV, and I can remember having the pajamas and the posters. I used to have a Dr. Teeth poster above my bed, which I was actually a bit scared of, because he had this huge face and this big gold tooth. But the Muppets were just sort of always there for quite a long time, and Sesame Street, which we got a little bit in the UK, and Fraggle Rock, of course. And as you say, we got a different version. Nobody knew. We didn't know while watching it that we were getting a different one to America and Canada. But bizarrely, the lighthouse keeper. Well, this is it. We got the lighthouse. Fraggle Rock is a lighthouse in the British version, and the lighthouse keeper, was an actor called Fulton Mackay, who is Scottish and who is in Local Hero.
Mm-hmm.
And also John Gordon Sinclair came into it a couple of years later, who was also in Local Hero, which was bizarre.
Like,
so at the time,
he regenerates like Doctor Who, like he,
yeah,
incarnations of the Lighthouse Keeper.
well, yeah, and I think at the time I probably thought it was a Scottish program because it was a Scottish lighthouse keeper. So, yeah, Local Hero. Fraggle Rock. I loved it at the time. The music was fantastic, and just it was funny. And Uncle Traveling Matt was great, and he was, yeah, the whole thing just worked for me. And so I suppose just over the years, I've been just slightly obsessed by all these Jim Henson productions, and have bought various books about them. And there's a great biography by, I think it's Brian J. Jones, I think is his name, who is, it's a brilliant book. When a few years ago, I think it was 2011 or 12, I went to LA to the TCM Classic Film Festival, which is one of the best things I've ever been to. And I managed to get a tour of the Henson Studios, which was Charlie Chaplin's studios originally. And you can, so yeah, but it turned into the Jim Henson lot, and now it's run by Henson, the children who, his kids that run the studio now. And I got a tour of that, so that was amazing. But yeah, so I don't know, at some point I thought, I can't quite pinpoint when, but there is a book series called Walt's People, Walt as in Walt Disney, and it's a book series. There's maybe about 20 of them now, and they're interviews, the transcripts of interviews. And I thought, why has nobody done that with Jim Henson? So I thought I would have a go, and writing a book like, let's say, Local Hero is a quite a big task, and it takes a long time to do all these things. So I was trying to think, how could I maybe do it a little bit quicker, but also just get the same information out there. So what I've done, they're going to be transcripts of interviews with people who worked with Jim Henson in some way. Now they might not have been best friends with Jim Henson, but they worked close enough with him that you can definitely say they knew him and they worked with him. So it's just different people. And actually Fraggle Rock, there are quite a few people who worked on Fraggle Rock, and some of the co-creators. So we've got Duncan Kenworthy, who was there right at the beginning, and he was one of the key people who sort of helped come up with the idea of how this series would work. And as you say, Victor Pemberton, who was there quite early on as well, and worked on the British version and was one of the producers, and also wrote much of it. And it was fascinating speaking to him. He also worked on Doctor Who in the 1960s as well. So that was quite nice. And sadly, he's no longer with us, but I hope he wouldn't mind me using his interview in this book, And so I've just spoken to people who worked on lots of different things, who directed things like Labyrinth, and people that worked on Dark Crystal, and as I say, on behind the scenes on Fraggle Rock. So some of the puppeteers that were in Canada, and the Muppet Show. So someone who worked in the publishing arm of Henson back in the day. So he worked when they were making the Muppet Show. He was there in a little office upstairs, and he says he would see Gene Kelly coming through, and all these famous people would come through the offices, and they would, so it's just so I suppose what I'm trying to do is try and pass on and share, preserve these stories of people that were there making these amazing TV shows and films, because a lot of them are maybe not household names, and you'll maybe never hear from them otherwise. So, and for me, it's just fascinating to hear. And so many people talk about, as Victor Pemberton did, talk about Jim Henson being a genius. And Victor said that, and he says, that's not really a word. It's a word that's really overused, but I think it's one that is really fitting. And I think I agree. I mean, I think I've not gone and looked up the exact definition of genius, or what is a real genius, but I think Jim Henson's pretty close, and I think it would be amazing if he was still here. I really wonder what he'd be doing. I think he'd be at the forefront of, if he hadn't retired by now, but I think he'd be at the forefront of technology and doing incredible things. And I even spoke to one of the guys that worked on Muppet Vision 3D, which is the 3D thing at Disney Studios, Walt Disney World and and Disneyland. So just hearing about how Jim was involved in that, because that was really his last production that he did with the Muppets, and he died, I think, while they just completed it, and then he died. And at the same time, he was working on the deal to sell everything to Disney, and so he died before I think he signed the contract, or was very close to. So there's just hopefully just a little history of Jim Henson and his work comes through it. So yeah, I think it'll be really, really good. And I've been working on it for a few years, and just other things, but I'm doing it myself. I'm just going to self-publish it. So when people commission me to do things like Highlander or Local Hero, that means that gets put to one side. Plus the day job, because I do all this in my spare time. So this is not even my my full-time job. It's my weekends and evenings. So I'm working on that, and I'm hoping, I keep saying soon, and it will be soon, because the interviews are basically all done. It's just me. I've got to sit at the computer and just transcribe them and make them look nice, and so they read properly. So it's getting closer. It'll be this year, and I'm hoping. I've now got to move house, actually, which wasn't my plan last year. So that's happening in the spring. So I think, let's maybe say the summertime. But it's getting closer, though. I promise.
Well, I'm very excited to read it, and I hope you'll consider coming back to the show so we could, talk a little bit more about Henson in depth, because I would love to see all the perspectives of all the various people who've worked with him. And yeah, thank you so much for coming to talk to the show. I had a great time talking to you and just, nerding out about movies. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I hope I didn't go off on too many tangents. And I'd be happy to come back, because I think Jim Henson, I'd love to talk more about Jim Henson's work and just the people that worked with him as well, because that's the other thing is, of course, his name is above the door and all these things. He's the one we see, but it was a huge collaborative effort, and I think it's great that some of these people who you maybe haven't heard of, I want to just give them shine a little bit of a spotlight on them, so that the fans and new fans can discover their work. So thank you. Thanks for having me on. So I'll speak to you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, listeners, for listening along. Please pick up all the books that we talked about here. Look for them online. This has been Jenn in conversation with Jonathan Melville, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.